It's been a hard day's night, and I've been working like a dog. It's been a hard day's night.
Good evening, and welcome to the Story of Liberty with Dr. Marshall Foster and Dan Williamson. I'm your host, John Bona, and we're all around the country. Marshall's out in California, and Dan is in a beautiful little town called River Falls, Wisconsin. And I'm here in beautiful Vero Beach. Good evening, guys.
Good evening, John. Marshall. Good afternoon, John.
Hey, guys, you know, I just had a roast beef sandwich. I tried to help out the economy. I just went over to Arby's here. I probably haven't had one of those in 10 years. But it tasted pretty good. So I'm doing my share to contribute on the production side today, you know. And that's what we're going to talk about, the economy. And we'll probably start, there's so many different areas. I'm about to make a pretty profound statement, I think. I think we know how to fix the economy. I think if people listen to us, they'll understand there are solutions to fix our economy. Now, I'm not saying we have all the answers, but we know what the Bible says and reinforces a system in which, for example, like property belongs to individuals, not the government or a society as a whole. And we'll talk about property first. And we see this implied in the Ten Commandments, you know, for example, because the Eighth Commandment says, you shall not steal, right in Exodus 20:15. Now, this assumes that human beings will own property. Families will own property, business. And it belongs to them, not to other people. So I shouldn't steal, you know, my neighbor's shovel or his garbage cans. As you know, a neighbor of mine actually once tried to do that. I caught him stealing my garbage can. We're still good friends. I can never figure out why he wanted my garbage can. Anyway, and of course, this reasoning goes further in the 10th commandment, right? That we shouldn't covet or anything in our neighbor's house or anything else that belongs to our neighbor or to the community. So this assumption of private ownership of property is this fundamental code in the Bible. And it puts Scripture, anybody who's a Christian listening out there, you have to know this. This will put this in direct opposition to what we're hearing about today in socialism or a communist system. And I don't really see a difference. I know there is, you know, practically there's a difference. The two to me are almost the same that have been advocated by people like Karl Marx. But Marshall, you know, and I appreciate you joining us again. You're the World History Institute for over 30 years. And by the way, people, if you'd like to contact us, you can contact us at thestoryofliberty.net. Or if you have any questions for Dr. Marshall Foster, he's at the worldhistoryinstitute.com out there in lovely California. And he's got bigger problems out there than we do here in Florida, believe it or not.
What private property out here?
Yeah. Man, Marshall, that's it, isn't it? The theory of socialism, communism, you could sum it up with a single sentence, right? Abolition of private property, right?
Well, absolutely. And this is nothing new. We fail to understand that communism didn't start with Karl Marx in the mid-19th century. It was all the way back to Rome, Greece, and you can take it back to Babylon when Nimrod gathered all the people together to build his temple and forced them in slavery to do so. What you have in the ancient world, except for one small example in all of the ancients and through all the tyrants of history until you reach the Pilgrim Fathers, you have no example of a nation that did not steal the private property of its people through the government or through the leaders. And this is the great sin of our time, is the fact that man being who he is, beginning with Cain and Abel, he's sinful. Man is sinful. And we tend to steal others' goods. That is the way of human nature. And until about 1900 in America, all Americans were basically brought up in church. They were brought up to understand the basic Christian doctrine that man is sinful. And because man is sinful, you don't trust man, corporate man, or the government with absolute power to control your property and control your life. But in the 20th century, there's been this new doctrine taught that society is good, that government is good, and that you can trust good government. That good government will then take the money from the rich and give it to the poor like Robin Hood, and because they are so good and benevolent, that they'll do it in a way which everybody will end up happy. This is the biggest lie in the story of history. It's been going on for 5,000 years, and it's just a new brand today.
You know, Marshall, you're so on, because our founding fathers understood this principle, and I love the way they state it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, meaning you look at the nature of the world we live in, and man is sinful, and man will try to take what is not his. That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. My understanding is Jefferson originally coined that phrase, pursuit of happiness, as private property, but they wanted it bigger because they wanted it to encapsulate not just property, but your capital holdings, the ideas of your mind, the creativity of your hands. And if we go back to Samuel 8, where Samuel is coming before God in prayer and says, God, they want a king. And God says, look, they're not at you, Samuel. They're really rejecting me. Because if you look what happens when you lose your inalienable right to private property, to that pursuit of happiness, all of a sudden the ability to give God what is God's becomes impossible. Because the king takes first, and I'm using the king as an idea here, the king will take first and prevent you from even doing what you're supposed to do, that God owns all the cattle and all the hills, and that it's something we need to do. God does not need our stuff. He has all our stuff. We need to give to God. So when the king steps in and takes all the land, or the government takes all the land, and in John, socialism to communism they're like blood brothers. Socialism is the preparation to become communist. That's how I look at it. So when you become a socialist culture, you've begun that redistribution, that seizure of private property. You've begun that rebellion against God, which is a warfare against God. And then suddenly you find yourself in a spot where you cannot even do what you believe is self-evident and true to give to God what is God's. And that is where we're starting to find ourselves in this country. As we've practiced socialism light since probably 1929 with the Depression of 1929, since that point forward, and the Roosevelt administration and the government really usurping more and more power, we've already been practicing socialism light long enough that I'm not so sure we can detect the difference between socialism and communism. We are moving into it quickly.
Well, that's it. Yeah, when any government, we'll talk about that today, particularly America, can overtax, regulate, Dan, like we see in our business, just regulation after regulation, throwing hurdles in front of you constantly. And, ultimately they control your property. You ask yourself the question, is it yours? Every move you make. And that's one reason why socialism, by the way, I got an email. It said that there were 60 to 70 Democrats in Congress that admitted they're socialists. They're part of the Socialist Party, believe it or not. Now, but I wonder if these people understand how incredibly dehumanizing it is when private property is abolished. It's taken away, when the government controls all economic activity. When the government does that, what you could buy, where you live, what job you'll have, and therefore, what you're going to train for is what happens in socialistic countries. Where you go to school, and how much you'll earn. It's all controlled. It essentially, I don't know if they understand this, it controls all of life and human liberty. That's why we call this the story of liberty. because human liberty is destroyed in that socialistic system. It's literally taken away, and it enslaves people, and it destroys human liberty. And boy, Marshall, you know, it'd be a great thing to see our government change as we were promised in 2000. What was that? 2000, I guess. What was that? The change we could believe in date. That was
change 2008.
2008. Change we could believe in. Right. Well, you know what? Outside of the proper government purposes, like a government office building, which there's too many of those anyway, but military bases and streets and highways, stay out of it. Let private enterprise work. Let the free market work, right?
Well, exactly. And here is our basic problem. When you said at the beginning of the program, we have a solution to our economic woes. And we do. And that solution is in the hearts of millions of Americans, but not enough. For what has happened is that many Americans, if not nearly 50% of them, have been socialized. What I mean by that, they've been given a new worldview in which they believe that their lives are basically under the control of an all-powerful state.
Right.
And that all-powerful state is going to feed them and clothe them and care for them in their retirement and take care of their needs, and if they need to go to the hospital, take care of them. And it's not a matter of family anymore. It's not a matter of individuals being accountable, responsible for their own property, but it's now a matter of the government stealing from others to give to me. So that you develop a mentality that is of itself enslaving. You become the slave of the state, whether or not we call it that yet or not. And that mentality of slavery or dependence upon the state is manifest in the kind of people we elect to be our leaders. And we have elected leaders in Washington, D.C., and this is true at the state level as well, who have taken control of our lives because we wanted them to. I know that a lot of people will be saying in the audience, well, I don't want them to. But in reality, if you voted for that kind of person who is a big government advocate who wants to control your life, then you are a person who we know who your God is. Your God is the state. You have now got a dependent. Whoever you depend on for the basic functions of life is your God, right?
Right.
And if you depend on the government to meet those needs, then the government has become the God of the American people. So I think there's a lot of introspection needs to go into this. What have we allowed to happen to America, where the very founders of free enterprise, those people that believed in private property as the basic structure and reason for government, are now allowing the government to become the enemy of private property. We've only allowed that, I think, because of our lack of education and ultimately our lack of courage to stand up against it.
Marshall, don't you think we've also forgotten? I mean, I'm looking at George Washington's farewell address here, and he says, with slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. You have in a common cause fought and triumphed together. The independence and liberty you possess are the work of joint counsels and joint efforts, of common dangers, sufferings, and successes. And then he says, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable support. I think we've educated ourselves away from these founding principles. We've allowed, as it says in the book of Joel, the enemies of God to creep in quietly, and they were picked out for perdition at the beginning of time. And I think that falls at our doorstep, the Christians, that we did not stand guard on the walls, and we did not speak up when the time is right. So I think one of the absolute critical events that has to happen in our day, which I think it's the day to do it, is we need to once again start standing up on the wall and speaking the truth. So people hear it, begin to think about it, begin to realize that they've been deceived. Like you say, Marshall, we've voted people into all these offices, and statistically, Christians are just as guilty of these elections going in the directions they go as the people who are non-Christians. I mean, we put all these people in office, and they move in a socialist direction, and we get excited when suddenly there's a communist person when, in fact, we already are in socialism light. And that's because the pulpit really hasn't been aflame with righteousness, as de Tocqueville put it. And I think that's part of the problem here. We've forgotten the past. We've forgotten what the founders tried to warn us and teach us and give us documentation to help us be ready in a time such as this. So my encouragement to Christians out there, if you're hearing this talk and wondering, wow, is this out of control? Well, some of it is, but the moment it isn't the darkest hour yet. There's still plenty of time to speak out, start to change our ways, pick people who are righteous and honest to put into office, not for political expediency, but people who actually will stand for the truth. And I think those numbers are starting to grow, and that's going to make the other side very fearful, so they're going to strike back hard. But private property is a key issue that has to be addressed. Private property has to be that. You own it, it's yours, and no one can take it from you. And I think that's the principle that's going to come out all the way across, including property tax reform and you name it. All these areas where people can take your land because you don't, by edict, follow the sword, shall we say, that's got to change. And John, you and I both know that every time we turn around trying to do something in the business world, we're tripping over one more authority after another who's got a new set of rules and wants to tell us another way to do the same old thing.
And that's what we're talking about. You know, in our next several programs on the economics of our nation, and we've already had a few programs. We'll have several more. You know, what really should be the role of government regarding a nation's economic system? That's what we're talking about. We're focusing on private property today. But the government should both document and protect the ownership of private property. And I think it does that fairly well as far as documentation. You don't have to worry about somebody going down to the title department and stealing your land with a piece of paper. But on the other hand, where we do a lousy job is shown right in Scripture when, and Marshall, I know you've talked about this, when Samuel, I always use this example, I don't know of a better one, and Samuel warned the people about the evils that would come upon them by the king, actually a monarch, right? With so much government power that, and the word take is said over and over again from the people, and confiscate things for his own use. And I heard you talk about in our last program. And to me, I think that's what people have to realize. You know, if you want the state to be your God, like Marshall talked about a minute ago, that's what that God will do. He will take, and take some more until there's nothing left. And now, unfortunately, That's been tragically fulfilled, Marshall, throughout history. You have studied history of all the nations for the last 30 years. You have seen this over and over, right?
Oh, exactly. As I said when we started, that it began with Nimrod, but it, you know, the great answer was given by Moses and the Ten Commandments and the children of Israel, who, by the way, had the most productive economy in the ancient world when they followed God's law and became the wealthiest people in the world under David and Solomon. But the point is that because they followed this conception of private property, because they followed the Ten Commandments, because they had local governments and local control, and because people's inheritances were kept in perpetuity, so they owned the property forever, the result was that you had this tremendous explosion of growth, because when you have family dynasties growing up through the generations and you're passing down an inheritance from child to son, from father to son, you end up having a tremendous amount of productivity. Just touching base with the Ten Commandments for a minute, just like you said earlier, John, the commandments specifically deal with private property. And this makes the issue of the economy and private property a very spiritual issue. Think about it. Of the 10 basic commandments that God gives us down from Mount Sinai, 4 of them deal with honoring God, the first 4. The last 6 deal with private property. Because the one starts out, number 5, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long. Honoring your father and mother puts property and relationships within the family. How do you honor your father and your mother? You take care of them when they get old if they need it. You care for them as they will care for you. It becomes a family thing. It is the honoring of father and mother. Then it says, you shall not murder. What is the biggest private property you can steal from somebody? Their life, right? You shall not commit adultery. You're stealing another man's wife. That is theft of property. Not that he owns her or she owns him, but there's a sense in which they are one, and when you break up that union, you are stealing property. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. When you bear a false witness, you're destroying a man's reputation. When you destroy a man's reputation, in many ways, the Old Testament considers it worse than murder, because a person is killed in terms of his reputation, but he's got to keep living. You've destroyed him, but you've destroyed his property, and his most important property is his good name, right? And so all of these things, right down to coveting, all of them deal with not just stealing, but deal with private property. Once Christians and believers, and even people who aren't, who honor the Ten Commandments, begin to understand that this is a fundamental premise. You don't disobey God's law breaks you. And so if we continue on the premise that these things are not spiritual issues, and that private property, how much they take away, whether it's 20% taxes or 60%, that's all a decision of government, has nothing to do with my church or my personal life. As long as it's out there somewhere, then you don't feel, and I don't feel, the personal accountability for the fact that God is going to hold us accountable for this highly important spiritual element of life on this earth. If we allow people's property to be stolen, and if we steal it ourselves, or allow the government to steal it for us, then we're accomplices to a terrible sin that is destroying our children's children. And let me say one other thing, and that is that this understanding that we're sharing today is not something that is not known by others. In fact, our enemies, our communist Chinese enemies, know that Christianity is the foundation of America's economic success. Let me tell you a real short story. A scholar from China's premier academic research institute, they pay for this huge institute to figure out what made the West historically so much more economically powerful than China. And they went through a 20-year study. And at the beginning, it says they thought it was because we had more powerful guns. And then they continued their study, and they found out that, no, they had the best political system. And they said, no, that's not it. And they said next they found out that, they have a better economic system. Yeah, well, we did. But in the past 20 years, they have begun to really realize that the heart of your culture is your religion, Christianity. This is a quote from him. This communist scholar is saying that it is why the West has been so powerful is because of Christianity. The Christian moral foundation of social and cultural and economic life was what made possible the emergence of capitalism and then the successful transition to democratic politics. We don't have any doubt about this. These are our enemies who are communists, who are saying what made America great was Christianity and the application of Christianity to economic principles.
We've got less than a minute left here. Dan, if you'd like to wrap us up here for the second half.
Well, I was going to say, Marshall, you're hitting the nail right on the head, because what are we really talking about? We're talking about God's covenants. And when we break God's covenants, whether it be a husband-wife, thus, we don't commit adultery, or we don't covet a neighbor's wife, God's covenants are powerful. And a nation that covenants with God is a nation, when they obey God, God's going to bless them. And that's what America did in our founding. We covenanted with God. We were blessed.
All right, folks, we'll be back in just a minute with the story of liberty.